having killed their own king and massacred his Swiss guard and the majority of his defenders and leading men, having brutally murdered those who refused to swear eternal hatred of the king and aristocracy, and after having gone so far as to dig up the decaying bodies of much of the French royalty to disgrace and destroy their remains, having engaged in what author Nesta Webster would call an orgy of hatred, lust, and cruelty, directed not only against the rich, but still more against the poor and defenseless, the destruction of science, art, and beauty, the destruction of the churches, the organized campaign against all that was noble, all that was sacred, all that humanity holds dear. Having accomplished this destruction of their nation, the leading players of this revolutionary violence now turned on one another. Virtually every last figure most responsible for plunging France into this chaos would die a violent death in this handful of years. And it was at this point that it would become obvious to all looking on that these men weren't creators at heart, but destroyers. Nor were they leaders or great organizers of men, but rather mere critics. They knew how to tear down and obliterate, yet they didn't seem to have a compelling vision of what might be created in its place. If you're going to kill the father of a household, you must be fully prepared to be the new father, or have some suitable structure and plan in place to fulfill this role. This was not the case in the French Revolution, and what might justly be called the satanic brutality of it all was to carry an incredibly important lesson. With regard to such major pivot points in history, and especially national revolution, the means matter as much as the ends. How a people reach the goal will forever be remembered, and will inexorably shape and color all else that follows. And thus, France would now be a nation forever followed, stalked, and encompassed even by an incredibly dark cloud. The more easily or obviously justified revolutions across history have often been due to a critical mass of strong and capable men believing themselves to be governed and ruled by their inferiors, who then see this insult compounded by their corruption or the tyrannical misuse and abuse of this power. Pre-revolution France, whose nobility had been not just their martial elite, but the cultural and artistic envy of much of the world, and whose king, certainly no tyrant, was willing to make countless concessions to the people, certainly didn't fit this mold. Despite a scattered few parallels, this wasn't like the American Revolution, which was a case of a colony throwing off the yoke of its distant master across the Atlantic, demanding only self-rule and leaving her former master's structures and cultural institutions and her traditions and history fully intact. What had happened in these few years in France had been something unprecedented. To many, it appeared more like a suicide than any exciting rebirth. There would be several pendulum swings in the coming decades and centuries in which more conservative, royalist, and monarchist forces would briefly hold some influence again. But the center point from which this pendulum swung was powerfully altered by this revolution. A violent lurch to the left so powerful that monarchy came to be painted from this point forward as a great evil, and democracy as a practically unassailable sacred cow. This democratic doctrine of mob rule that the greatest minds throughout history, stretching back to Lycurgus and Plato and Aristotle, thought to be the worst of all possible forms of government, would suddenly come to be embraced as the ideal throughout much of the Western world, providing the powerfully deceptive illusions of choice and freedom, while allowing moneyed powers to exercise immense control behind proxies, masks, facades, and subtly yet powerfully manipulated elections. Among the great many works penned about this momentous revolution, Edmund Burke's steps forward as not only one of the most informative, accurate, and insightful, but roundly impressive and lofty, and, speaking personally, the closest to my own heart. Labeled by Edward Gibbon, quote, the most eloquent and rational madman that I ever knew, and widely respected before publishing his work at great personal cost. As a result of its publishing, he would die hated by a great many, even deemed a bigot, an elitist, and a conspiracy theorist, to the extent that he requested to be buried in an unmarked grave, by some accounts due to his knowing the depths of depravity that those he spoke out against were capable of. An Irishman of noble birth, and not the type to follow the crowd, in his works were the words of what Julius Evola might have called an aristocrat of the soul, who fully understood the profound, deeply rooted value of all of the structures and traditions being so flippantly dispensed with in France. Burke believed these machinations, traced back to their core, represented the newly ascendant moneyed powers, propping up organizations of lawyers and sophists to inflame the hearts of the people against the aristocratic caste, the martial and spiritual elite, and all traditional ruling orders, the military, the nobility, and the church. He believed their goal was to decimate these, to be replaced with secular humanist, atheist, materialist, and what we might today call Bolshevik or communist individuals and ideas. A class of men who were natural lawyers at heart, with the most attractive words and superficially convincing concepts and ideas, who then used these oratorical gifts to convince the masses that they were being brutally oppressed and claimed to provide an escape, even, perhaps, a path to utopia. Burke speaks of one new innovation in particular that so helped win the public over to the cause, the satirist and cartoonist and critic, and how these men were directly supported, handsomely yet covertly, by the money men behind the scenes, and who had an immense effect on the public psyche, as humor always does in its subtle, understated way. He refers to the Rights of Man as, quote, that grand magazine of offensive weapons, fully recognizing its power to reorient and reconstitute the culture and the political and economic structures of France in a manner that essentially inverted what he believed to be the natural order. He expresses shock at the extremely low bar in Parisian courts with regard to confiscating land from the aristocracy, to then freely grant to all allies willing to assist in the process. I spoke earlier about the fall of the Goths, and as a direct result, what seems to have been one of the most massive transfers of power, wealth, and land ever recorded, records that seem to be becoming increasingly difficult to come by. The French Revolution might be said to have succeeded in repeating history in this regard. Much like the corrupt Byzantine Empire of late Rome under Justinian, the new institutions created by the revolution helped elevate land and wealth confiscation and redistribution to a science and to a machine-like efficiency. To give one example of many, the traditional force for preserving law and order was the army. But because the vast majority of the officer corps came from the nobility, these became the enemy of the revolution, practically overnight. Many of the most skilled and competent officers were murdered, causing serious disorder in the ranks, and many of those who weren't killed attempted to immigrate to more friendly nations, perhaps hoping the madness might soon abate, only to watch as all of their land and possessions were quickly confiscated by revolutionary courts. In his work, Burke warns that the result of atheistic revolutionary forces conspiring with the money interests of France will be that, quote, the whole power will lie with the money men. And he goes on to speak to the shrewd psychological methods employed. Quote, all the envy traditionally directed at wealth was directed down other avenues, end quote. This seems to be a remarkably effective tactic. covert players with immense wealth, using numerous fronts and proxies to convince an impressionable public that the real power brokers aren't them, but rather everyone or anyone else, thereby rallying an army to clear the path for a level of dominance that the more traditional hierarchical structures would have made impossible. Burke seemed to clearly see this as a move to tear down in every sphere, not to create or build up. Quote, "The writers against religion, whilst they oppose every system, are wisely careful never to set up any of their own." Many saw this trend as beginning in earnest with the Medicis in the 1400s, as this family and their immense wealth helped quite literally create the philosophy of secular humanism out of whole cloth, funding the greatest minds of their age to construct this new ideological framework, while simultaneously beginning to marry directly into the royal bloodlines of Europe, two events that would have the most significant historical ramifications. This period helped kickstart what would become an ever-present factional struggle that would rage across all of Europe between an ancient hereditary aristocratic land-owning element and a newly ascendant moneyed power, powerfully aided by secret societies and their machinations, who had kings and their monarchies first and foremost in their crosshairs. Prior to the rise and fall of National Socialist Germany, the term Aryan, and specifically the root Arya, was widely considered to share etymological roots with the term aristocracy. The debate rages as to the origins and precise meaning of the term across multiple ages and cultures, but it's almost always used in reference to the ruling nobility. It's recently become a controversial theory, especially in the highly charged and exceptionally politicized modern era. But some seemed to view the true factions across these multiple revolutionary movements not along national lines, or even purely political or religious, but rather along cultural and racial lines. Starting with the Roman Emperor Caracalla, freely granting citizenship to the slaves of a rapidly failing Roman Empire, distinct familial lineages lived side by side across much of Europe, stretching through to the St. Bartholomew's massacre of the Huguenots, and culminating in the aftermath of the French Revolution and Napoleon's France as we enter the 1800s. A massively disproportionate share of this bloodshed seemed to be suffered by a certain ethnic and cultural group. E. Cummings was said to have quipped that the events of this period, quote, "chopped 6 inches off of every Frenchman," seemingly a reference to the taller and fairer-skinned population who suffered most in both the revolution itself and the resulting wars just afterward, those more direct descendants of the larger Germanic people group, ranging from Nordic elements to the patriarchs of Rome to the more ancient Celtic stock. Compelling thinkers and authors and orators, Abiseus is a great example, began to stoke these racial tensions as a means of increasing revolutionary fervor. These claims were largely true. The noble and aristocratic class in France was certainly more heavily Germanic, that is to say, ethnically of the Germanic people group, as opposed to specifically of the nation of Germany, giving the outward appearance of a caste system of sorts from a certain perspective. Quote, "Hereditary nobility now descends through the lines of the conquerors. The third estate will become noble again by becoming a conqueror in its own turn," end quote. And as author David Dennis put it, quote, "The battle against everything Germanic that had commenced in the Renaissance continued in the form of hatred toward everything German." The goal of these foremost players in the French Revolution in particular seemed to be nothing short of a total inversion of the natural order, as exemplified by the words of the new president of the National Convention on November 21st. Quote, "Representatives of an independent people, important to mankind was the day when the National Convention of France pronounced its sentence. Royal dignity is abolished. From that day, many nations will, in future, reckon the era of their political existence. From the beginning of civil establishments, Kings have been in opposition to their nations, but now they rise up to annihilate kings. Reason, when she darts her rays into every corner, lays open eternal truths. She alone enables us to pass sentence on despots, hitherto the scarecrow of other nations." End quote. Quote, "But we shall have done nothing if we stop here. Aristocracy still domineers. We must therefore suppress all authorities existing in the hands of the upper classes. When the revolutionary authority appears, there must nothing of the old establishment remain. A popular system must be introduced. Every office must be occupied by new functionaries, and the sans-culotte must everywhere have a share in the administration." End quote. And there's no doubting that many of the foremost players in stoking revolutionary sentiment seemed very much the polar opposite of this ancient aristocracy in every respect, spiritually, psychologically, even physically. Robespierre was 5'3" and wore lifts in his shoes to hide this fact. Danton was terribly scarred and disfigured. But perhaps no single man better epitomized this movement as an uprising of monsters, more than Jean-Paul Marat. And in fact, few men seem to better represent the very pulse and ideological center point of this particular revolutionary ethos. In many respects, Marat might fairly be called the Karl Marx of his age. He had the ability to powerfully compel others, not due to any natural charisma, but rather stemming from a clever and shrewd and strategically astute mind, in the manner of an almost supernaturally manipulative intellectual and firebrand. And yet, this mind seems to have been fueled almost entirely by envy and resentment, or perhaps more accurately, as Nietzsche so well put it, resentiment. His ambitions and drive were such that some felt he was, at least figuratively, possessed by demons, though many scholars today argue it may have been late-stage syphilis at work. Considered insufferable and deeply disliked by most who knew him, he was the type of man instinctively feared by many, because he so obviously had nothing to lose, and not just in a material capacity, but in the deepest sense of that word. He seemed incapable of love and utterly consumed by his hate, and thus he represented the specific sort of fire and passion that so many would-be revolutionists were actively seeking. And, like Marx, he was a natural-born extremist, and would soon come to exemplify the worst excesses of the revolution. One of the surviving descriptions of the man states, quote, "Marat had the burning eyes of a hyena, marked by spasmodic convulsions of his features, and a rapid and jerky walk. His countenance was toad-like in shape, marked by bulging eyes and a flabby mouth, his complexion of a greenish, corpse-like hue. Open sores, often running, pitted his terrible countenance. He wore no socks, and his boots were usually filthy." End quote. This description continues to get far more graphic in the elaboration of his truly disgusting physical maladies, which I'll spare the listener from hearing, but which weren't merely being cited for shock value or to disparage the man, but rather because it's likely they played a fundamental role in shaping his character. It's difficult to find anyone who more reveled in the bloodshed and the suffering of innocence, or anyone who worked harder to cause it. And it's not difficult to understand why some came to see him as a demon in, vaguely, human form. Such men had won the day, but they'd also stoked a profound, righteous indignation in the hearts of the remaining nobles they'd not yet slaughtered. Charlotte Corday, born in Normandy to minor aristocracy, came to sympathize with the Girondin moderates over the radical Montagnard element represented by Marat. Revolted especially by the September massacres, she disagreed also with the execution of the king, and believed Marat would plunge the entire nation into civil war. On the 9th of July, 1793, she left her cousin, reportedly carrying with her a copy of Plutarch's Parallel Lives, and set off to Paris, where she took a room at the Hotel de Providence. She bought a kitchen knife with a 6-inch blade and spent the next several days writing her, quote, address to the French, friends of law and peace, to explain her motives to her people. She had initially planned to assassinate the man in front of the National Convention, but soon found he was no longer attending the meetings due to deteriorating health, thus was forced to change her plan. She went to Marat's home before noon on July 13th, claiming to have knowledge of a Girondist uprising. She was initially turned away, but on her return that evening, Marat admitted her. At the time, Marat, strangely, conducted most of his affairs from his bathtub. As Marat took down the names of the Girondists supposedly involved in the uprising, she pulled out the knife and plunged it into his chest. He managed a final call for help, but to no avail. Narrowly escaping being lynched by a mob of Marat's associates and true believers outside, she was eventually brought to trial, in which she described Marat as a hoarder and a monster, respected only by degenerate men and only within Paris. Finally, a letter written to her father was brought forward as clear evidence of the premeditated nature of the act. Quote, forgive me, my dear Papa, for having disposed of my existence without your permission. I have avenged many innocent victims. I have prevented many other disasters. I hoped to keep it incognito, but I recognized the impossibility. I hope you will not be tormented. Goodbye, my dear Papa. Please forget me, or rather rejoice in my fate. The cause is good. I kiss my sister, whom I love with all my heart, as well as my parents. Do not forget this verse by Corneille. Quote, crime is shame, not the scaffold. End quote. It is tomorrow at 8 o'clock that I am judged. This 16 July. In her defense, she stated confidently, I have killed one man to save 100,000. And on July 17th, wearing a red overblouse denoting a condemned traitor, standing alone in the tumbril, drenched by a sudden summer rainfall, it said she remained calm and stoic to the end. The guillotine fell, and Charlotte Corday was dead. Jean-Paul Marat's death helped kick off what's come to be known as the Reign of Terror. Beginning as a way to harness revolutionary fervor, it quickly degenerated into the settlement of personal grievances. In the style of the revolution, the introduction of suitably broad and generic phrases, like enemies of freedom, allowed for tremendous flexibility when it came to creating the pretext for powerful players to strike out at perceived opponents. It was in this chaos that Robespierre played the leading role in causing the execution of his one-time friend and ally, Danton, though at great cost. Danton was the more compelling speaker and used these abilities, consciously or not, to subtly sway the crowd against Robespierre in at least one major instance. Said by his critics to be devoid of honor and principles, a, quote, statesman of materialism, who, quote, was bought anew every day. He'd become mysteriously wealthy over these first years of the revolution, and was now viewed as having lost his fire for the revolutionary process. After the death of his wife, having remarried a 16-year-old, quote, rumor has it that he was allowing domestic happiness to tempt him from the keen, incessant vigilance proper to the politician in such a crisis. Though certainly one of the leading players of the revolution, Danton would be just one of a great many to fall during this reign of terror. According to archival records, from September 1793 to July 1794, some 16,000 people were executed on charges of counter-revolutionary activity. Another 40,000 may have been summarily executed or died awaiting trial. After the death of Jean-Paul Marat, Maximilien Robespierre, perhaps the best known and leading personality and key figure of the revolution, fully stepped to the fore and is named president of the convention. Robespierre was a unique figure. Yes, a Mason, and yes, a Jacobin, and yes, like a great many of the leading players, a lawyer, descended from generations of lawyers. And yet, despite his membership in several such public and secretive organizations, he seemed to be one of the few not wholly, or at least not exclusively, driven by them, or the puppeteering hands that so deftly guided them. Robespierre seemed to be a passionate true believer. As Mirabeau quipped, "That man will go far. He believes everything he says." He became the most tireless advocate for what was to become the brand new god and central ideological pillar of a new, reinvented France, one that would go by the name of reason. This might roughly be equated to the modern cult of science, in that it's a subjective framework built by fallible and speculative intellectuals, yet that masquerades as unquestionable objective truth, intended to posture as solid ground, to present itself as standing in contrast to all the unstable territory of superstition and misapprehension. A student of Rousseau, in a sense attempting to follow in his footsteps, he was to commit what many believe to be one of the most grievous errors in the history of human judgment, and cultivate a misconception of nature as a force practically independent of the Creator, reducing it to a purely material and mechanistic machine, devoid of any divine spark or larger purpose. By redefining the concept of nature and turning the traditional notion of God upside down to create a new, quote, supreme being in his place. In one stroke, this small group of men managed to reframe and reorient all of human existence for all who would listen. Redefining the most weighty of all conceptions into something ultimately hollow and superficial was equivalent to killing God in a sense, and meant that all other concepts, naturally downstream from this highest and foremost conception, would gradually and organically come to be redefined as well, including the concept of virtue itself, which Robespierre promptly redefined to justify violence against all opposition, which detractors said made him, quote, one of the most effective terrorists in modern history. And in an effort to completely break from all semblance of tradition, the new France was to even have a new calendar, with completely new names for the 12 months, which would now have 30 days each. Its new week was to contain 10 days instead of 7, and its years were to now be reckoned starting from year 1, beginning in 1793. In short, these men were attempting to recreate everything, to completely destroy all inheritance, and in effect start over. The problem is that so much of what was to be replaced still held deep, even spiritual, power and significance, and it was being replaced with rootless intellectual inventions and whimsical speculations. At the end of the day, as Aldous Huxley would later put it, Robespierre achieved the most superficial kind of revolution, a merely political revolution, ultimately hollow, yet attempting to masquerade as something like a spiritual rebirth. To many looking on, including Burke, and including many German thinkers of the day, what had occurred here was a monstrous mistake. According to them, things as serious and weighty as leadership and governance and political structures should develop and change slowly. They can't simply be the intellectual products of a handful of men sitting down to create a fully formed plan of action. Von Humboldt gives us the prevailing German point of view of the day by stating, quote, "No state constitution could succeed if based wholly on reason according to a pre-established plan. Where time and nature had not prepared, quote, constitutions could not be grafted upon men as sprigs upon trees. But, as Johann Goethe was to put it, the French nation is the nation of extremes, it does nothing in measure. This proud and powerful nation, held up by its neighbors as in many ways the standard bearer of a unique culture and style and flourish, of elegance and beauty and artistic competence, of bold and courageous and unbounded thinkers and a fiery spirit, had somehow stumbled into brutally murdering many of its best and brightest, at the behest of many of its most mediocre and ambitious. She had seemingly become a nation that traded kings for sophists, nobility for lawyers and bank clerks, devout clergy for speculative philosophers. Though it certainly had its supporters, especially at the outset, by the time the dust had settled, much of the world seemed to look on with a mixture of confusion, alarm, or outright contempt. As the author A.M. Ramsey put it in The Nameless War, quote, "Never before had a mob apparently organized successful revolution against all other classes in the state, under high-sounding but quite nonsensical slogans, and with methods bearing not a trace of the principles enshrined in these slogans. Never before had any one section of the nation conquered all other sections, and still less swept away every feature of the national life and tradition, from king, religion, nobles, clergy, constitution, flag, calendar, and place names to coinage. Such a phenomenon merits the closest attention, especially in view of the fact that it has been followed by identical outbreaks in many countries. And this petty political revolution was one seemingly driven by a great deal of manipulative propaganda. The king, far from a tyrant, seemed willing to make tremendous concessions. The Queen, Marie Antoinette, had been widely beloved before the cartoonists and satirists began their handiwork. No lie was too shameless or brazen. No negative bit of gossip would go unprinted, even publishing several slanderous stories that directly contradicted one another. Even the famous "let them eat cake" phrase was never actually attributed to her in her lifetime, and represents just one of a great many later inventions, stemming from the caricature these papers had created. Her taste for the finer things in life was so absurdly exaggerated as to be blamed as a leading reason for France's economic woes. And on October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette was led to a guillotine in the center of Paris. A court had just convicted her of treason. As the prosecutor read the charges against her, including that of assault against her own son, she stated, "I was a queen, and you took away my crown. A wife, and you killed my husband. A mother, and you deprived me of my children. My blood alone remains. Take it, but do not make me suffer long." End quote. Maintaining her composure to the very end, including an hour-long cart ride in which she was mocked and jeered at by a public who were avid readers of the professional character assassins masquerading as satirists and humorists, she, too, was guillotined at 12:15 p.m. on the 16th of October, 1793. Her pitiable last words are recorded as, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose," having accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot. After her death, she would then be unceremoniously tossed into an unmarked grave in Madeleine Cemetery. If Marie Antoinette and King Louis represented royal blood that, though it may have lacked requisite courage or clarity of mind at the all-important moment, at least wasn't wholly bad or corrupt, then the king's brother-in-law, the Duc d'Orléans, might fairly represent the other side of that coin, and might even well represent the utterly fallen state of modern aristocracy. And the exploitation of his weakness by moneyed interests seems to speak to those timeless means and methods used to orchestrate that fall. A notorious degenerate, and always deeply in debt, he was also a Grand Master Mason, and, perhaps not unrelated, was the most shameless and aggressive opportunist. In the Duc d'Orléans, the blackest of royal black sheep and a ready and willing traitor was found. The Duke's Grandmaster status meant that instead of answering first and foremost to his nation or his fellow citizens, his highest allegiance was a secretive allegiance to a group with secret motives. It's easy to underestimate just how powerful such secret alliances are, but when the members of these societies are scattered across nearly every major organization and political body, across nearly every powerful nation on Earth, all quietly helping one another and working together toward unspoken goals, this collective power is truly immense. The Duke was also a degenerate hedonist, greedy and self-interested, and seemed to believe his cooperation with the revolutionary forces might result in his eventually sitting on the throne of France himself when the dust settled. This personality type, not the least because it was so easy to blackmail, was the ideal vessel for secretive groups to exploit. What's so striking is just how consciously Adam Weishaupt and his fellow agents recognized and spoke openly about the fact that their role was to deceive and manipulate, not just individuals, but even other secret societies. To quote Weishaupt's journal, "The great strength of our order lies in its concealment. Let it never appear in any place in its own name, but by another name and another activity. None is fitter than Freemasonry. The public is accustomed to it, expect little from it, and therefore takes little notice of it." End quote. Mirabeau, who was apparently prone to inadvertently revealing too much according to those closest to him, is said to have slipped up and openly stated in a speech at the International Freemason Convention in Wilhelmsbad in 1782 that he was a member of an organization that was influenced by the Knights Templar, and that their goal was to destroy the church and the monarchy, so that the, quote, religion of love could be established in France. And there was a period of time in which the men who represented the more public face of the revolution seemed to make an attempt to expose the private machinations at play, those who seemed to be using them as a mask, as tools to unknown ends. For instance, men like the Marquis de Luchet, who were opposed to the Illuminati but supportive of the revolution, and who in one of his speeches stated, quote, "There exists a conspiracy in favor of despotism against liberty, of incapacity against talent, of vice against virtue, of ignorance against enlightenment. This society aims to govern the world." End quote. Even Robespierre would finally state, in what was, according to some, the final speech that helped seal his fate, quote, "I dare not name them at this moment and in this place. I cannot bring myself to entirely tear asunder the veil that covers this profound mystery of iniquity. But I can affirm most positively that among the authors of this plot are the agents of that system of corruption and extravagance, the most powerful of all the means invented by foreigners for the undoing of the Republic. I mean the impure apostles of atheism and the immorality that is at its base." End quote. Perhaps one of the worst and most amoral, and thus most effective, of these pamphleteers and propagandists was one Jacques Hébert. His completely baseless accusations, especially toward the royals and aristocracy, became immensely popular, but were said to have angered even Robespierre, to the extent that he was said to have broken his plate as he slammed down his fork and shouted "imbecile" after reading a particularly lurid and absurd accusation of royal incest. A long-time criminal, previously fired for theft, Hébert, labeled by some the Homer of Filth, would start the infamous Pierre Duchesne, the petty and salacious publication that became expert at drawing the public in with the most lurid and base intrigue, only to then subtly plant the most violent and revolutionary sentiments in the public consciousness. The stories themselves encouraged violence, utilized the most foul and sexualized language and gutter wit, and came to appeal greatly to the lowest classes, who would come to shout the phrase, "Father Duchesne is very angry today," as they hawked his publication on the streets of Paris. His completely invented stories, sometimes even including entirely faked dialogues between various royals and aristocrats, became one of the reasons Marie Antoinette went from widely beloved figure to one so hated and despised. Like many of his peers in the critic and satirist world, he didn't just want to do away with Christianity, he wanted to see it face a violent and brutal end. The question of just where he received the resources to support his extravagant and decadent lifestyle has never been answered. It says much that while the royal family went to the guillotine with stoic dignity and honor, when a bear was eventually dragged to the blade, he's said to have gone screaming hysterically, fainting several times along the way, even causing the executioner to toy with him and stop the blade just short a full 3 times in a row, merely to prolong his petulant agony. While the streets of Paris were stained with the blood of both the enemies and now the instigators of the revolution, there were significant regions outside of this cosmopolitan center that remained untouched by the revolutionary propaganda and fervor. Regions growing ever more suspicious of its aims, especially in Normandy, Brittany, and the Vendée. In the Vendée region in particular, a royalist counter-revolutionary movement began. These were largely simple, honest, and powerfully devout and God-fearing Catholics. And though a ramshackle force thrown together by peasants and a handful of nobles, this newly created army of men initially swept all in their path, in short order scoring several impressive victories. Soon, however, the entire military force of revolutionary France, including a massive number of newly drafted citizens, were to be marshaled against them. Outnumbered 3-1, and with a great many in their ranks dying from disease and starvation, the Battle of Savigny marked a pivotal defeat for the Vendée royalists. A loss that resulted not just in a defeat on the battlefield, but, to the eternal shame of those involved, what's been called perhaps the first modern genocide, as the new French government ordered a scorched earth policy, destroying farms, crops, burning forests and villages. They simultaneously engaged in a campaign of mass killing, universally aimed at the residents of the Vendée, regardless of combatant status, political affiliation, age, or sex. One specific target, in fact, were the women of the region, justified as primary targets because, quote, they were carrying anti-revolutionary babies, end quote. Just as the royalists feared, it was as the battlefield combat ended that the real slaughter began. Between November 1793 to February 1794, over 4,000 were drowned in the Loire under the supervision of Jean-Baptiste Curie. From January to May 1794, 20,000 to 50,000 Vendean civilians were massacred by armies that came to be known as the Infernal Columns of the brutally cruel general Louis-Marie Turreau, an army that seems to have been employed almost exclusively in the butchery of unarmed civilians. The estimates for the total number of killed on and off the battlefield in all conflicts related to the Vendée uprising range between 150,000 and 500,000, out of a population of just 800,000. The sheer chaos unleashed by the French Revolution would eventually, indirectly and through the strange and unpredictable twists and turns of history, pave the way for the rise of Napoleon and irrevocably change the face of Europe and the world forever. August 10th, 2021 marked the 200th anniversary of the unveiling of the Lion of Lucerne. Commissioned by a Swiss guardsman by the name of Val Altishoffen and crafted by Denmark's Bertal Thorvaldsen, Mark Twain was said to have called it the most mournful and moving piece of stone in the world. The dying lion, collapsed upon broken symbols of the French monarchy, commemorates the heroic last stand of these 760 guardsmen who fell in defense of the king, including the full names of the 26 officers involved, along with a Latin inscription which translates, "To the loyalty and bravery of the Swiss." And indeed they were, loyal, honorable, and courageous to their final moments. In speaking of the character of the upstart revolutionary government, Burke states, "Already there appears a poverty of conception, a coarseness and vulgarity in all the proceedings of the assembly, and of all their instructors. Their liberty is not liberal, their science is presumptuous ignorance, their humanity is savage and brutal." End quote. He goes on to compare this newly and artificially born state and its founding men with the more traditional and conservative elements of the Western world. Quote, "All your sophisters cannot produce anything better adapted to preserve a rational and manly freedom than the course that we have pursued, who have chosen our nature rather than our speculations, our breasts rather than our inventions, for the great conservatories and magazines of our rights and privileges. You had all of these advantages in your ancient states, but you chose to act as if you had never been molded into civil society and had everything to begin anew. You began ill because you began by despising everything that belonged to you. You set up your trade without a capital. If the last generations of your country appeared without much luster in your eyes, you might have passed them by and derived your claims from a more early race of ancestors. Under a pious predilection for those ancestors, your imaginations would have realized in them a standard of virtue and wisdom beyond the vulgar practice of the hour, and you would have risen with the example to whose imitation you aspired. Respecting your forefathers, you would have been taught to respect yourselves. You would not have chosen to consider the French as a people of yesterday, as a nation of low-born, servile wretches until the emancipating year of 1789. End quote. Burke seemed to believe that the illusory pull of mob rule is strong, and yet fundamentally misleading. Where the mob rules, the predatory men who most effectively program and orient the mob will dominate. He believed there will always be a more powerful and influential class, with outsized political or economic or social, even cultural or spiritual influence. So it's not a question of if this class will exist. The only real and substantive question becomes what types of men should ideally make up this class. And in this regard, he believed France had taken several steps backward. And, quote, "The next generation of the nobility will resemble the artificers and clowns and money jobbers, usurers and Jews, who will always be their fellows, sometimes their masters. Believe me, sir, those who attempt to level never equalize. In all societies consisting of various descriptions of citizens, some description must be uppermost. The levelers, therefore, only change and pervert the natural order of things. They load the edifice of society by setting up in the air what the solidity of the structure requires to be on the ground." End quote. To Burke and those like him around the world, the monarchical structure was part of something ancient, timeless, and worthy of real respect. The king was to be something akin to God's right hand in this material plane, ideally the visible manifestation of the divine masculine, and his queen, the divine feminine, to be the mother and father of a nation and a people. In recalling his own encounter with this queen, many years previous, he states, quote, "Never lighted on this orb, which she hardly seemed to touch, a more delightful vision. Little did I dream that I should have lived to see such disasters fallen upon her, in a nation of gallant men, in a nation of men of honor and of cavaliers. I thought 10,000 swords must have leaped from their scabbards to avenge even a look that threatened her with insult. But the age of chivalry is gone. That of sophisters, economists, and calculators has succeeded, and the glory of Europe is extinguished forever." And finally, quote, "When ancient opinions and rules of life are taken away, The loss cannot possibly be estimated. From that moment, we have no compass to govern us, nor can we know distinctly to what port we steer. And this is the story of the French Revolution.